Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Conference on World Affairs. It is 12:30 on Tuesday, April 10th. This is session 2206. And our topic today is political correctness. Am I a snowflake or are you just a jerk? I thought one of the things that would help the panel is to do a little poll. I'm very curious, how many of you self-identify as snowflakes? Does that mean the rest of you are jerks? So, thank you. It was suggested that I define snowflake, and when I was assigned this, by the way, I'm Bob Morehouse, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. When I was assigned this, I was intrigued, and I realized I wasn't really sure what snowflake meant either. And so, of course, I dug out the Urban Dictionary, because that's our standard now for definitions. It's being used extensively as a put-down for someone who is easily offended or felt they needed a safe space away from the harsh realities of the world. So I'll use it in a sentence for you. Comedians have a hard time performing on college campuses anymore because of all the little snowflakes running around that get offended by just about anything they say. So do you feel I should try to define the word jerk? Would that help? Yes. So it's a real pleasure to introduce our panel today. I think this is going to be a very lively conversation. And I'd first like to welcome Tai Tashiro. It's a little awkward trying to introduce him because, as probably most of you know, Tai is the very well-known author. Oh my God, this is very awkward here. But Tai is a social scientist, and he's the author of a book called Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome. And an Amazon book reviewer said, interweaving the latest research with real-world examples, Awkward provides valuable insights into how we can embrace our personal quirks to harness our awesome potential. With that, I'm happy to introduce Tai. Next to Tai is Malou Innocent. It's a real pleasure to welcome Malou back. She was here in 2016. She hails from Philadelphia and is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Her primary research interests include the Middle East and Persian Gulf security issues and U.S. foreign policy toward Pakistan. So she has a lot of experience knowing how to offend people. One of the quotes that I picked up from some of her writing, a Boston University professor said, "Striking a balance between values and interests requires something more than glib posturing. Their concept of ethical pragmatism provides a way to find that balance." That's a quote from her recent book called Perilous Partners. Welcome, Malou. Thank you very much. And last, and welcome, Brandon. Great, just right in time there. That was perfect. Brandon, this is, I think, your first time at the Conference on World Affairs. So welcome. He's an American sociologist and a criminal justice advocate, and also a U.S. Army veteran. And Brandon is motivated by a desire to improve the quality of life for Black and brown families and other victims of systemic discrimination. And he's the founder of Rahim AI, which really sounds fascinating to me. It's a app that he's developed that helps the public rate police interactions. There again, I think a great setup for an area that we all agree on right here in Boulder. So I'll read a quote that he wrote from a publishing, it's in a publication called Medium, where he said, like slavery, police violence isn't just oppressive, it's also pervasive, inasmuch as it precludes us from building intimate, meaningful relationships with people we'd otherwise care for deeply. And this is kind of a backdrop to the fact that his best friend and partner was killed by police violence in 2007. Really welcome to our panel, Brandon. So with that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, we're going to just go right down the line, speak for up to 10 minutes to get the topic rolling. We'll have a few minutes for them to talk amongst themselves, and then we'll have questions. So one little housekeeping note, if you've been to some of these panels, we're trying to get people to put their questions on the app, but we'll be doing it both ways. For the snowflakes or the jerks, we have two systems. I'll just read this, it's easier that way. In this session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. And I'll be getting them up here. Hopefully I can figure that part out. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. I really encourage you to think that way. If you're a student, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. Any questions about any of that? All right, happily we'll begin. Ty, it's up to you to get us launched in this topic here.
Okay, here we go. Well, you know, when I thought about this political correctness topic, one of the things I tried to think about is what is the core psychological process that underlies it. And there could be a few things, but one of the things that occurred to me is that there's offense taken, right, when political correctness has gone poorly for some reason. And to understand why we get offended at social behavior, it's useful to take a little bit of a look back. One of the things to keep in mind is that life expectancy for most of human history was under 40 years old for 99% of human history. It's only in the last really 200 years that we started to live longer now. And that means that for most of the time humans were alive, it was a real struggle to stay alive. I gave an example in the first book I did about the number of calories people had on average for thousands of years. If you did yoga for 15 minutes, if you were living 2,000 years ago, you would have died after a few weeks because you didn't have enough calories to support even 15 minutes of yoga, above and beyond what you had to do to forage for food and defend yourself. So that just, context is kind of helpful because that says, well, how did culture evolve then? How did social interactions evolve to maximize survival? And as you all know, as social animals, coordinated human interaction is critical for our survival. We forget that because we're such social animals. It's like the fish in water kind of thing. But we made a bet a long time ago that our cooperative efforts would generate more survival value than just going at it on our own or in very, very small groups. So if you had a group of 30 or 40 hunter-gatherers, how would you set things up to maximize survival? Well, one of the things you need to do is you need to make sure everybody's fair, right? If you have a limited amount of food, if you have a limited amount of water, you need to be careful that everybody's getting equal distribution. If somebody's cheating, you need to know about that. Also, when times were more violent, you need to know if somebody was going to betray you or betray the group. And so humans evolved extensive psychological hardware to be able to identify small deviations from fairness, small deviations from loyalty, and were wired somewhat to be attuned to people who are what psychologists call pro-social. So you're generous in nature. You have the group before the individual. Okay, so let's take all that, and if you have a society where everybody's fair and loyal and a little bit generous, then things are going to go well, right? Now, fast forward a little bit, and all of a sudden you go from living about 40 years on average to almost doubling that now, right? So in a lot of Scandinavian countries, life expectancy is around 80 years old. We're around 78 years old here in the United States, and that's created some luxury, both in survival but also economically. We don't have to think so much about getting enough calories. In fact, we worry about the opposite now, right? We don't have to worry so much about just finding food on average. We worry about whether it's organic or free range or all these other kinds of things. And that's a privilege, right, to be able to fuss about these kinds of things. Now, obviously, there's still a lot of people who suffer in the United States and elsewhere who don't have food and water and safety. And I don't want to offend anybody by thinking that I don't recognize that. But if you look at humans on average, we've never had it better. You know, on average, we've never had it better. The question to me is this: what do we want to do with that state of affairs? The fact that we've never lived longer, that we've never been more prosperous in so many ways, what do we want to do as a society with all of that abundance and all of that privilege? There's a lot of amazing things that we could do, right? That's not maybe happening in all the ways that one would hope, right? And one of the things we've done is started to create divisions that are fairly artificial and not always that meaningful. We get overly reactive sometimes and overly judgy to small slights that really in the large scheme of things don't matter, right? You've all been on the receiving end of that. You've done something that you thought was just relatively innocuous, or you were even trying to be nice, and someone took offense to it and judged you and thought that you were a bad person because you didn't meet their social expectation. And that of course, feels terrible. Now, what can we do about that? Well, one of the things that psychologists think a lot about is intent. So is it the case that when someone offends you, their intent was bad? Now, I hope it's not the case that you can think of many instances of this, but when was the last time that somebody did something to you and you felt offense and it was actually premeditated intent? Like maybe they had a personality disorder or something and they just wanted to make your life miserable, right? And so they premeditated this thing that would make your life miserable. It doesn't happen that often, actually. Most of the times we feel offense, it's just an accident or just a misunderstanding. It's interesting being Asian American sometimes and thinking about this. I think I'm relatively liberal on the spectrum of things. And it's interesting sometimes when I meet folks who just haven't met a lot of Asian Americans, and that's fine, right? Now, what happens if I go to pick someone up for a date? This was in high school. I'm not still picking people up from their parents' house now. But imagine I'm there in Longmont, and I go pick someone up for a date, and this really kindly family is there to greet me. And, you know, I think there were 3 Asian American kids in my high school of 900. So not a lot of exposure, right, to a lot of cultural diversity there and norms. And the mom said, you know, Thai Asians are just such clean people. I was like, that does not characterize me, but I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we had a whole conversation about the numerous ways that Asians are very clean. It actually made me feel worse about myself, but I didn't fit the norm. You know, I had a wonderful, wonderful chemistry teacher in high school. He had quit a vice president job at one of the major auto producers. And he was a fancy engineer there. And he thought, kids don't understand basic chemistry and basic science. He wanted to go teach high school. Just unbelievable guy. Now, this was, you know, back in the late 80s, early 90s. And so the Japanese were still doing well economically at the time, right? And so he'd have this motivational speech he'd give. He'd say, the Japanese can do stoichiometry. And I would just sit there once again and be like, I can't do stoichiometry, you know? So I don't know what my friends would kind of laugh at it and so forth. Now, in both of those situations, would it have been the right thing for me to, one, take offense, and two, verbalize that offense? I don't think so in either situation, right? It'll still happen to this day. It's not PC to call Asian Americans Oriental, for example, but people will say very nice things while saying I'm Oriental. And to me, from my perspective, that's okay. Okay. Now, I might correct it. I might say, hey, that's just so you know, that's not really what people say now. But I think, to me, it's too bad when someone has good intent and they're trying to build a cultural bridge. They're trying to understand your perspective, and they make a few mistakes or whatever. It's not quite up to the level of PC-ness that you would hope for. And then you jump all over their case. Well, now where are we at? Functionally, we've just really ruined the interaction, ruined the hope of actually building that cultural bridge. I also recognize that it gets tiresome. And, there's things I don't experience that other folks experience that would probably weigh on me more than some of the things that I would deal with on a daily basis. But I think this notion of intent, to me, is a really critical thing for us to think about when we think about political correctness and how we want to get along with one another.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. You all can hear me okay? Wonderful. Great. So I'm going to start off with just some of my own definitions of what political correctness means, what Snowflake means, and why it serves a good purpose and why sometimes it can go off the rails. First, I'll argue how this has evolved over time. I think political correctness has been with us for many decades, and sort of why the latest iteration of it, which I would call the latest iteration being cultural appropriation. It's part of this long history of political correctness, but it's a different animal entirely. And I think we want to ask ourselves who is empowered and who is marginalized when we invoke political correctness, because it may actually harm those it intends to help when we are too politically correct. And I'll like to wrap up later with ways not to be a jerk. So first, let's start off with some definitions. Political correctness. Standards of decency that govern our behavior, especially in cross-cultural interactions, particularly if we want to be sensitive to minority groups. And minority groups doesn't necessarily have to be gendered or racial. It could be, for instance, the fact that we call the deaf the hearing impaired. Man, dude, you are a party foul. Good thing I wasn't swinging in the conclusion. Anyway, I'm just kidding. Bob's great. Another example is illegal alien, undocumented immigrant, or prostitute, sex worker. So the University of New Hampshire actually came out with this pamphlet of, they encourage people to use first-person construction rather than, what it does is it actually creates more of a clunky way of describing people. For instance, instead of referring to a poor person, you say person who lacks advantages others have. Or obese would be people of size. And it sounds like a random content generator where you just you put something in and you spit something out and it comes really clunky and it obfuscates, and sadly it becomes a mockery of what was something that was supposed to be serving a social purpose. And now it basically becomes what Vincent Hutchins at the University of Michigan calls linguistic jujitsu. Now it's an epithet to put people down with political correctness. And I think this gets to the idea of snowflake. Snowflake, I would describe it as people who are so protected and thin-skinned that they melt at the slightest discourse that may upset them. And this is, we've seen various iterations of this, whether it be trigger warnings, we want to be protected from psychological harm, or microaggressions, these are sort of unwitting statements or backhanded compliments. And I think, to Ty's point, it sort of removes intent. It's not the idea that you maliciously intended to harm or stigmatize someone. You could just be ignorant of something or be unwitting in your remarks, and then it's taken offense by others. So is this a passing fad, or is this sort of a sign of the times? I think it's been with us for quite some time. In fact, this is a debate that's been raging especially in higher education and academia, since the late 80s. Some of you are too young to remember this, but there was a number of alarmist books in the late 80s, early 90s. The Moral Collapse of the University, Tenured Radicals, The Moral and Spiritual Crisis in Education, and a national bestseller in 1987, The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. And basically what these books attributed the issue to of this growing political correctness were the problems of post-structuralist literary theory. It's the idea that rejects objective reality. It's that there are no universal truths, and thus no narrative is privileged over another. And it tends to reflect local conditions and historical factors. And in the West, of course, that would promote, according to those who promote this idea, cultural uniformity and privileged and the powerful over the oppressed and the victim class. And Berkeley philosophy professor John Searle, my alma mater, Berkeley, he wrote a very interesting article about this in the New York Review of Books about all of these sort of various books at the time. This was back in 1990. And I would encourage you all to read it if you can. It was in the New York Review of Books. And he sort of distills this argument about what's happened in academia and the growth of political correctness on college campuses thusly. It's the idea that the history of Western civilization is oppressive, imperialist, patriarchal, hegemonic against women, ethnic and cultural minorities, and that the canon of Western civilization consists of authors almost exclusively who are Western, white males, and accordingly the works that form the basis of liberal education and the core curriculum are inherently elitist, hierarchical, and unrepresentative. This would be Plato, Homer, Shakespeare, Dante. So at the time when this debate was raging, you also had Hispanic Americans and African Americans who felt left out of the canon. Understandably, they felt excluded and marginalized from the inclusion of the liberal curriculum within universities. And of course, we've all been the better because we've opened that discourse to those voices. I think what happened, though, is that these things sort of intersected and intertwined, where you had the culture wars of the late 80s and early 90s intersecting with this idea of early ideas of snowflake culture. So what happened is that you saw this academic literary criticism thrown into conventional wisdom. And so all of a sudden we started having this relativism thrown into everything regarding, modern American life, religion, ethnicity, entertainment, art, child rearing, psychological norms. All of a sudden everything began to be dissected according to this relativity and this idea that there's no objective truth, that no narrative is privileged over others. And it sort of permeated the political discourse. So now I'm going to transition to this latest iteration of it and what we've seen lately. And this is something we've seen in media and in entertainment, this notion of cultural appropriation. What is cultural appropriation? A show of hands, how many of you have heard of cultural appropriation? Okay. Oh, wow, a fair number of you. Great. Okay, excellent. Just so we are on the same plane here, it's the idea of the adoption or use of elements of a culture one doesn't belong to by a different culture. And there's cultural borrowing, for instance, something that increases awareness and diversity, versus cultural theft, something that's considered malign or malicious or stereotyping of a certain culture. Just last year, there was this debate raging in I believe it was Vogue and Cosmo about whether parents should allow their daughters to dress as Moana. This is a Polynesian Disney character, and there was some controversy about whether the parents should allow their kid to dress up as a Moana character. There's also some debates about Rihanna. She was on the cover of, I believe, Arab Vogue, dressed as Nefertiti, and there was criticism. Well, she's not Egyptian. She's not African. She's American. She's, what is she? Bahamian. So, of course, she was appropriating that culture. Then there was also the controversy several years ago of Katy Perry dressed at the Video Music Awards as a geisha. Like, who is she? She's not Japanese. She's not of Asian descent. Who is she to dress up as with these cultural outfits? And so this has been sort of a raging debate for some time, and I think it is the latest iteration of this political correctness culture. I think, again, this sort of, it gets misguided. I'm just going to put all my cards on the table. I think it's misguided because it begins with the conceit that something belongs to one race or one culture or one people, and it cannot be shared. Especially in a society like ours, where we are the only sizable nation on Earth that was peopled almost exclusively by immigrants. So it's obvious that we're going to be sharing each other's culture. And I think the issue gets to one that Ty mentioned about intent. Does one intend to harm others through cultural appropriation? But I think there, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are attempts to help those who are marginalized and oppressed, and in our attempt to help, we inadvertently cause harm. And so I'm just going to run through some really quick reasons, and if I go over time, I'm just going to leave it for Q&A. This idea of purity, for instance, this is my issue with cultural appropriation, that it's almost pro-segregationist in its very extreme logical conclusion. It seeks to segregate and freeze cultures. It resorts to this almost cultural protectionism, the idea that we must freeze cultures in a specific vacuum of time and that identity and culture are static. But as we see, cultures are dynamic, they're fluid, they grow and they expand, and they mingle with other cultures. Another idea is that it's sort of an ad hoc hypothesis. It gives marginalized minorities sometimes, I think sadly, the permission to do exactly to others what they accuse others of doing to them, which is to stereotype, demonize, shame, and silence. I think it's also sadly hypocritical, because oftentimes these political correct notions come from the very people who claim to promote diversity. These were once the champions of liberal tolerance and a defender of freedom of thought. It's also presumptuous. Why are these people the paragon of virtue? Who makes them the moral arbiter of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? And in terms of, authority, in terms of what's cultural theft or what's cultural borrowing, who's the authority on this? Who decides what magical words of deference would constitute a proper level of appreciation or respect? How much fealty must be paid to produce a sufficient level of respect? I think it's also can be quite harmful. It further divides marginalized minority groups by creating a new system of hierarchies. It perpetuates the confusion and the divisive resentment that have long hindered minority groups. I think it can also be self-marginalizing. It can engender bitterness toward the already marginalized groups. It undermines whatever sympathy they seek to inspire from others and makes them come across as too touchy. It's also ahistorical. We got algebra from the Arabs, paper from the Chinese, Rolling Stones from American blues. This is again the cross-pollination of cultures. And look at Nepal. Nepal is not a distinct ethnic country or group. It's a hybridization of India and Tibet and Mongolia. Should Nepal not exist? I mean, seriously. And I have a few others I'd like to get to, but I'm going to leave it for the Q&A. But I want to skip really quickly. One before I go to how not to be a jerk, is that the Romans had this idea of bread and circus. They give the public food and entertainment and they'll be distracted. And I think hopefully this isn't where we're going with the idea of political correctness. Or perhaps it's the fact that we've reached such a level of affluence that we can fight with one another over these little disagreements. Because I find oftentimes when I talk to people who want cultural appropriation to be ended or are politically correct, I agree with them on issues that are more fundamental, like let's fight for criminal justice reform. Let's fight mandatory minimum sentencing. Let's fight for those larger issues. I'm with you on those. I feel like when we get into the weeds about, who's a higher victim, who's on the victim hierarchy, it gets really, really dangerous, and it's incredibly distracting. And I can go into that in the Q&A a little more. In terms of how not to be a jerk, let me just close with this. Ways not to be a jerk. I think others you may speak to may fall short of our lofty ideals of inclusivity. And so, others may just be speaking out of ignorance. And so be patient in your quest for equality. So I'm going to go with the bad and the good. So the bad is when you preemptively cut off conversation. The good is when you try to advance understanding and you sort of create a deeper appreciation in others. Bad would be when you stop agreement from being heard because you just want to shut them down. A good idea would be to move towards a sensible discussion and to clarify their understanding. You've heard this phrase, check your privilege. That's a great idea. I mean, check your privilege. We should always be questioning our premises. Like, do I come from a particular perspective and should I question it? Of course. But if that's used as an ad hominem attack just to shut someone down, that's bad. That's a jerk. Move in the direction of trying to open dialogue and be polite. Just because you disagree with someone, understand that they may just come from a different perspective and that they may genuinely be open to discussion. We should try to facilitate mutual understanding and social cooperation and not just say, well, you're part of an oppressor class and, you have your boot on my neck. And that doesn't really get us all that far, especially when you're trying to convince someone. We move from conversing to sort of sermonizing, to nagging, to demanding, to antagonizing. And that like spectrum is very short in a conversation, and it could go from conversing to nagging to demonizing in a heartbeat, and that would be a jerk. And also, it removes context or malice or intent from any political discussion. So my conclusion would be not to be dogmatic, please be patient, and we're all trying to make the world a better place, so think about your intent. Thank you.
Wow. I mean, I have to follow those two. Well, it's great to be here in Boulder. This is my very first time ever in the state of Colorado. Yeah. And so, I don't know, have you, well, you've been here, but have you been? Okay. Well, oh, shit. Okay, well, I'm behind the times, aren't I? Well, nonetheless, I really appreciate the love and support that I've had as I've navigated this place earlier this morning. I went on oh, sorry, I'll speak up louder. I apologize. I was just saying thank you. So I want you to hear that. So I have much to say about many of the topics that were discussed, none of which I intended to talk about today. But considering I'm at the end of the panel, it is almost like something I have to do. It's an obligatory response needed. But so there are 3 or 4 things I actually want to run through. One, I want to run through the history of this country in particular, because when we think about what is political correctness, I think mostly about this country. It doesn't mean that PC doesn't exist in other areas of the world, but my experience has, quite frankly, been fairly limited to the United States. I also want to go into some personal history. I then want to talk about this idea of political correctness from an academic perspective, and then end on intent versus impact. So the history, who here is from Oklahoma? Okay, has any, holy, what? There are 2 people in the audience from 3 people in the audience. You tried to hide, Oklahoma. 3 people in the audience. I mean, this is better than the last panel. There's only 1, but this is amazing. Okay, so so the history of Oklahoma in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the very first time that this country used, or anyone in this country used bombs to throw out of an airplane. They destroyed in 1921 nearly 600 to 700 black-owned businesses. They killed nearly 200 African-American families. In 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, if you've ever heard of this idea of Black Wall Street, it was the wealthiest African-American community in the country. And I'll go into the history a little later, but quite frankly, there was a guy who stumbled upon, who was an elevator operator. A young white woman got off the elevator and tripped over the young man's foot. She screamed and she got hurt. I don't know how bad, but to an extent where the family, her family and her family's friends, decided to hunt down this elevator operator, and they ultimately ended up not being able to find him, and so they got upset and they burned down nearly 700 businesses. And sharecroppers will use planes essentially to do that. Riots of 1921. I was born there. That's where I'm originally from. And my grandfather was one of the first African-American men to own a nightclub in the city of Oklahoma City. Police had harassed him so often that he needed to close his business. And he lived homeless for the rest of his life and turned to alcoholism. I met him for the first time when I was 16 years old. He died when I was 19. I was born to his daughter, my mother, who needed rehabilitation, but instead got jailed. She was pulled over for a red light, And without going into the long history of how we used to reward and promote police officers in this country, it was how many people who were felons that you could bring off the street. That would be a way in which we would promote you, right? It was the way we measured performance of police. And this was interesting to me because what happened around that time, and still to this day, is that police officers would take drugs, for instance, off people who were felons, right? And say they would take, would steal drugs from those felons, keep enough drugs to then take those drugs and plant them on people who would be casted as a misdemeanor, but now they are a felon. Because why? They would have an incentive because they would be able to be promoted more often as they bring in more felons. My mom got caught in the middle of all that. This was the 1994 crime bill that we often talk about, implemented by Bill Clinton. So, and my mother at that time was not, abusing any substance, but she had come to learn to abuse a substance. She got addicted to crack in prison. So it is the very place that my mother went to separate herself from the rest of society that she learned to cope using drugs. And then I was born shortly before that episode, and I had, my grandparents ended up adopting me because my mother was unfit to care for me. And I met for the first time a childhood best friend. Who's ever been in love before? Yeah? Yeah, that's good. Okay. Who's still in love? Okay, good. I fell in love for the first time when I was 15 years old, and I say this often. It was like falling asleep in class. It's something I didn't mean to do, but I did. And I fell in love with my best friend from middle school. And we lived homeless in a two-room shack, but it's amazing how a two-room shack can feel like a well-furnished apartment when you share it with someone you care deeply about. Fast forward 5 years later, my best friend asked me to marry him, and it was the happiest day of my life, without a doubt. In 2007, I got that call that told me that, Brandon, I don't know how to tell you this, but your partner's been shot. He was shot and killed by the Oklahoma City Police Department. And his love was radical, unapologetic, and it changed my life. And I became obsessed with understanding oppression in this country from the point of view of black people at that point. And after 2 years of crying and shit, I said, okay, let's get myself together. I went off to college, and part of my work at Georgetown, my alma mater, was to study racial microaggressions. So what are microaggressions? Well, there are three ways that we have, that clinical psychologists at least have defined racial microaggressions. And there are three types of microaggressions. The first microaggression is a micro-assault. And a micro-assault is, calling someone a racial epithet, the N-word, and referring to someone in a very, this is what many people would describe as old racism that is apparent and it doesn't need any deciphering. It is fairly clear that they do not like you for the color of your skin, either through action or through some speech. That is a micro-assault. A micro-insult is not as easy to understand. I'll give you an example, and it's often not intentional. While I was at the university, I was actually working in the philosophy department. Big surprise, I'm a philosopher. I was working in the philosophy department, and my professor, who led the philosophy and justice and peace studies, asked me whether I was going to an event. And I said, no, I'm not going to be able to make that. And it was an event, it was like an open house event for the philosophy program. And so he was joking about being really upset about me being on the philosophy board, not being able to attend. And he said to me, Brandon, we're going to have to hang you. And this is a man that I know to this day who has done and contributed much of his time to the betterment of black and brown people, restoring justice in many and multiple communities across the country, but had a slip-up. And that slip-up now I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and believe that that was not intentional, but the slip-up, quite frankly, is because he was conditioned to view me in that way. Might be one assumption. But the other is that he simply said something without first sending it through a filter before it got to me. And that filter is oftentimes the lens we use to understand people and how to engage them effectively. The last microaggression is called a micro-invalidation. And this is normally when you are invalidating the racial experiences of people. And, well, before I get there, one more example about a micro-insult that is perhaps unintentional. All of my buildings at my university, at Georgetown, are named after white men. If they're not named after white men, they're named after men. If there are statues at the university, they are of women. Excuse me, they are of men. If there are statues at the university that are of women, they are depicting women only fully naked. And so what does that say to the psychological welfare and well-being of women that continue to attend a university that does not recognize them as being philosophers, journalists, media specialists, engineers, mathematicians, right? And then the third, I'll say, is a micro-insult. So oftentimes, if you hear someone say a racial joke, and it is probably not obvious to them that it's racist as hell, but it is very clear to you as the person of color on the opposite end of that spectrum that it was racist as hell. And you tell them it was racist as hell. And they tell you, Brandon, you are thinking too deeply about this issue. Why are you so preoccupied with race? Get out of yourself. Right? And so those are the three, just to lay the groundwork, that's what racial microaggressions are. A microassault, which is what we deem old-fashioned racism. Micro-insult, which might not necessarily be something we intended to do, but nonetheless delivers an impact to the person of color. And then lastly, the micro-invalidation. As I tell you how that made me feel, you've invalidated that racial experience for me because you don't understand how well I am, and as such, I am preoccupied with race. So now I want to talk about intent versus impact. I'll end on that. Before I do, I want to bring in a quick history lesson. So my history as an African-American man growing up in a rural city or rural town of Oklahoma, my experience, for instance, with police is not very good, right? It is not one that I understand to be safer when I see them. In fact, I feel less safe when I see police. But this isn't because police, even the most well-meaning police officer, she could step out of her cruiser with a uniform, nicely pressed, wanting to do good for the community and incredibly intentional about it. But the history of police for me and my family members is not that good, however intentional she is about being good. And quite frankly, the history of this country and the way that policing was institutionalized in the 18th century, it was to grab slaves who were runaways. That's how the institution of policing was adopted. It was to bring back slaves who would ran away from their masters. They wouldn't kill them because they wanted them to work more. And so if you think about the history of policing, when you ask me to, like my university says, get in the spirit of 1776, which is when our university was founded, I'm not interested in getting into the spirit of 1776. You might be all right with that, but there are clear reasons why the spirit of 1776 is not a place I want to revisit, right? And this doesn't mean that people are intentionally interested in harming me psychologically or putting me in places that make me incredibly uncomfortable. It is because the impact we have due to the history of this country and the position of many minority communities in this country is very different than it might be for other people. I'll tell you why impact and intent are different. So when we go to a restaurant, I'll give you a perfect example, why I am less interested in one's intent and more interested in the impact. When we go to a restaurant, well, before I get there, I think a fundamental question is, should we hold people with whom are unintentionally harmful to us culpable? Should we hold them accountable? Well, when you go to a restaurant and you order a steak, and that steak is, normally you want that steak done in a way that doesn't kill you. So you want to enjoy your steak, you don't want to die. You want it good, but you don't want it that good, right? So you want the steak cooked to some degree, right? Even if you want it rare, it needs to be cooked in a certain way. But the chef delivers you a steak that you think is fine to eat. You eat that, and you get incredibly sick. Now, forget the laws, but if the chef said, hey, you know what, I was unaware that meat needed to be cooked at 325 degrees for a period of time. I was unaware that that existed. What would you say to that chef? I mean, just blurt it out. What would we say?
Get another job.
Get another job, right? I mean, because we expect the chef, because of the privilege they have to serve us food and the position they're in serving us food, we expect them to perform at particular ways. And whether they know how to cook that steak well or not doesn't really matter. The intent wasn't to kill us, and we might get that. But we're not going to let it go. We're still nonetheless going to hold them culpable. I bring this full circle to how I imagine and how I envision the ideology of white privilege. I understand white privilege is not something that white people have garnered purposefully. It's not something that they said, hey, as I leave this womb, I'm going to be white. No, it didn't happen that way. They happened by chance to be white. But with being white comes a level of responsibility, much like the chef. You have a privilege, and whether you understand that privilege or not, whether you understand that that privilege can oftentimes enable. When one has privilege, that means there are those who do not have privilege, right? And so with that power, we are nonetheless, even if we think, oh, this isn't my job to do this, or even if we don't know that we have white privilege, personally, and this is only a personal stance, it's not one that I tell you to take, but venture off with me, I definitely hold white people responsible and culpable even when they don't understand that privilege, because it's not only an opportunity for them to get to know black and brown communities, but it is, with privilege comes great responsibility. And with that responsibility is the same responsibility we would charge with the chef who served us pad meat. That responsibility is one that we must understand who we are, how we contribute to a system, and how that system continues to demonize and oppress black and brown people, right? And I think of that in the same capacity as an able-bodied cisgender man. I am a man, and as I go into a room full of women, guess what I do? I shut the hell up. Because I understand that, and I'll end on this, I understand my privilege that oftentimes women are not heard. And so I do not talk. When I am in a position where I am asking someone to raise their hand, I don't say that because that's what able-bodied people do, but what are there people that are not able-bodied? So I think about my privilege, and I think I'll end on a note. I'll end on this. Many of us might believe that political correctness is something that is just something that is not that important. And I get that. And I get that some of us are thinking that political correctness is not important, but that might be because we live very different lives than other people. If you've lived a life where you not only have to deal with the hardships of being, an American or a human, because no matter how fun this life is, there are challenges for each human being in this life, okay? And we painted the picture very nicely, but I still believe we have challenges, right? And on top of those challenges, imagine the challenges that non-cisgender people have to make, transgender people have to make, women have to make, non-white folk have to make. On top of the challenges that ordinary humans have to make, there is this added pressure of needing to navigate life. And so when you come to this place of whether one is politically correct or not, you're not only ending up at this place as, oh my God, you're being too sensitive. That person might have actually engaged and thought and navigated the world incredibly different than you have. And their level of tolerance, while you navigate through life without, very much difficulty, their level of tolerance might not be the same as yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brandon. A quick housekeeping note. One of the questions came up. I'm home watching the the live screen, and the feed collapsed. Can you tell from the back room, did that pick back up? I didn't see that comment come up any further, but I thought I'd just ask. This is being live fed all over the world. There are 50 million people watching. So what I'm going to ask is, because of our time, I want to bring you in on it as well as the three of you to sort of interrogate each other. I think this has been an amazing opening. I wish we had an extra hour to get into this topic. That would be absolutely wonderful. But if any of you want to raise your hand, the producers would be happy to give you a card or fill out the copy. I have a handful of questions. But why don't we do really short little takes among the panel here to just keep the conversation going? Anyone want to start that?
I mean, I just had a huge education about so many things from both of the other panelists. Really remarkable things said. So I'm still processing a little bit. But, one of the things that came up to me that I thought was really interesting was this notion of harm versus discomfort. And that might be an interesting thing for us to discuss a bit, and what the relationship is between those two concepts.
I have a few things, and thank you, my fellow co-panelists. My God, I mean, it was eye-opening, and so this is fascinating. I really like it a lot, and I don't think there's a great deal of disagreement. I think when we get into the particulars is where there might be some difference, but I think largely speaking, we all are proponents of equality and inclusivity. It's about how we go about it. I think the idea of intent versus impact, I think conceptually they're not mutually exclusive, and I think they exist in a balance, and so I think it depends on, what is the context, what is the situation, and I don't think we should ignore either of those things. We shouldn't ignore impact or intent in a given situation. One idea we may want to explore a little more deeply is direct responsibility versus indirect responsibility. I am the outgrowth of my parents, but I am not directly responsible for what they did or did not do. That's a tough situation, and I think we should explore that a bit more. There's also this idea, and I don't know where I'm going with this other than just to throw it out there. Nietzsche wrote about this, about the idea of punishing someone for doing something good and punishing someone for doing something bad. If you punish someone for doing something bad, they expect it. They understand it. Okay, I've done something irresponsible, and they deserve to be punished. If you punish someone for doing something good, do that enough times, and you're going to stoke resentment.
Yeah, I was also interested. One thing I didn't get to talk about is just this idea of cultural appropriation. And it's funny because at the house that I'm hosted in, I don't know if Alex is here, but it's great because we were having a conversation. it's funny because we're having a conversation with her son, Quinn, who's a 13-year-old boy, about cultural appropriation, which is an awesome conversation to have with a 13-year-old. But nonetheless, I mean, I've been schooled. So I've always thought about cultural appropriation as if, let me just lay the groundwork. I think cultural appropriation is when, there was a question that was asked, and I think you asked him, who has the say on what should be done with a culture, or who should participate, for instance, in a culture? And I love this debate because I obviously have an opinion about it. And I use, for example, the idea of hip hop. It's not an idea. It is hip hop is. Anyone familiar with hip hop? I just want to let y'all know. I mean, in Colorado, I know y'all still. In Boulder, even y'all got hip hop here. I lived in Germany for about 5 years, and they called hip hop black music. And they said, "Yeah, you're going to that club." I was like, "Yeah, is it hip hop? I don't know, but they play black music." And so it's funny. But anyways, hip hop in the late 1970s was a space. It was a genre that was created to express concern about systematic racism that took place, namely on the East Coast in New York. And that has evolved as an opportunity for discourse and dialogue. And so these hard concepts that we have and we debate about currently on panels with scholars who've had years and years of experience in studying was condensed into a 3-minute and 29-second song that you could play to your homeboy next door about, about systematic racism, right? And so when it comes to who owns that space, oftentimes I think it's the people, A, who suffered the consequences as the result of systematic racism, B, those with whom have developed the institution and safe space in which to talk about that concern. Those are the people, and so when I think about who owns that, I think if I look at that, I look at who has contributed to that. That's how we think about ownership, quite frankly. And I'm not too concerned about ownership in this country, but I do think it's important that when we think about who has the right to own or dictate A, B, or C, we shouldn't think about it we already think about this in very similar ways. Hey, have you contributed to this? I'm not going to go to I don't know if you have a house, but if you own a house, I'm not going to your house and be like, hey, you know what? I need to lay down. Why? Hell, I'll tell you why, because I ain't contributed to that bed, I ain't contributed to the floor it's on, the carpet it lie, or the house it's built in, right? So, and unless I've contributed to the greater culture that I'm participating in, I'm not, and the contribution is important because I'm not going to come in your house and start building a garden, right? I'm going to ask and consult with you in what ways can I help build. So I think the formula I like to use is, it is cultural appropriation when you participate in a culture that you do not contribute to elevating or uplifting people within that culture simultaneously. That you have taken more from that culture than you have contributed to it.
Thank you. So let me read a couple of the questions here that we have. First, we're taking preference on student questions. So the first one is a student question to the panel. What do you say to people that it's class, not race, that is largely responsible for injustice in the justice system, poverty, violence, drugs, etc.? Anyone want to take that?
I mean, well, there is a thing called economic racism. So I don't think that they need to be mutually exclusive. I think, look, I mean, I don't know if y'all know this, but I'm black. And I don't care where I go, I'm gonna be black. I can go to Korea, I can go to space as an astronaut. I'm gonna be black no matter where you go. And no matter how well I dress myself, I'm not going to be able to dress up my blackness, right? My partner was in a suit and tie when he got killed, you know. So I think the idea about class not intersecting with race, we have to be careful about how we envision that, because I think one might be the product of the other. So, you know, one of the things that I can do is I engage in a community. I am capable at this point in my life of earning more money. I mean, unless y'all have some like crazy fountains out there in Boulder in the hot springs that's going to make me turn a little lighter, there's no way I can work myself out of my blackness. I'm not even interested in it. But I think it's inescapable for us to separate those two, because black poor people live in a world where not only class is the issue and not only race is the issue, but economic racism is.
Excellent.
I would agree, and I would also say that I think there's been an attempt with the latest efforts to expand what would be the civil rights movement to those in the LGBT community. I think sometimes there's an erroneous claim that it was similar to the black struggle of the 1960s and 70s. I don't think it's exactly the same, because as you just mentioned, I mean, one could quote unquote fit in if they're LGBT more so than someone who has an identifiable marker that's immutable to their biology. And I think it's very difficult for us to say, well, it's the same sort of struggle. Well, no, it's not. If you can change the outward appearance of oneself much more easily than another person, I think that has a different set of impacts and a different idea of like how we're going to include those people. And I think it's easy to sort of slap a label onto certain things and say, well, you know, this movement is as similar as another movement. I think we need to differentiate those two.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, I also think it's important to acknowledge that black folk ain't been free. Black folk have been enslaved much longer than we've been free. Okay, I mean, like, we're talking about 50 some odd years black folk have been free. So think about the ways in which we've been able to participate in opportunities that earn us income. You think about education. Well, education was largely segregated. We had a lack of resources that didn't provide us to get land. What was the next important thing? Jobs. Employment. Well, oftentimes you weren't employed because you didn't have educational skill sets to be employed. And if you were employed, you weren't employed by white people more than 60, 70 years ago, right? And therefore, you also had problems in the network, which is also key because you weren't admitted to any of the universities that allowed you to build the network that we currently are able to build in the same system. So when we're talking about how class has impacted us, I think it's key, but I also think it's key as the way that race and racism has impacted black and brown communities in their inability to have social upward mobility, even when we've had the opportunity to take part in a system of class.
Yeah, I think we want to keep these two things separate, right? Social class and other things that would be more visible indicators sometimes that could be a basis for discrimination. There's penalties based on race, based on gender, based on even things like obesity that, you know, are pretty robust and consistent. But I think it's a mistake to confound those two things together. I think on the note of social class, though, it's really interesting to think about this idea from some political observers that, in fact, the Democratic Party did not understand social class well, and that this was one of the major problems in the last election. One of the things that stuck out to me was a photographer who had been doing a series in a lot of the states, actually, where Trump had strongest support. He wasn't there for that. He was just doing this photo series. And he said it was amazing to watch politicians come through in these communities that were decimated economically and largely white, and have politicians come through and tell them to check their white privilege. And they looked at these politicians like, what are you talking about? Like, we are suffering out here. And there was just this judginess and this cluelessness about social class and what that meant. So I think to the students' observation, that's a really astute observation.
Oh, just really quickly,
Yes.
just to your point, both of your points, you know, if you looked at the varied districts, I mean, I'm living in Pennsylvania, some of the varied districts in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan that voted for Obama flipped to Trump. And I think that's sort of the thrust of the argument about, well, if Sanders was the candidate, then maybe he would have had a better opportunity to win against Trump. I don't know. We don't know. We can't rewind time and see what would have happened. But you do get the sense that within the Democratic Party, there's this division between, I would say, the Sanders wing that looks at, and it's very similar actually to Donald Trump's economic policies in many respects about protecting American jobs, economic protectionism, ripping up NAFTA, those sorts of things. And then on the other side, sort of like the Clinton-esque of, I don't want to even call it intersectionalism, but this idea of like sort of the check your privilege line of the DNC. And I think they may have gone farther with the Sanders wing on the economic issues because of the very things that were afflicting the country in terms of the post-NAFTA economic devastation in many rural areas.
So just timekeeping, we just have 5 minutes left, I'm sad to say. Let me read 3 questions in a row here that are similar topic. How would you suggest people bring humor to the situation when they feel someone has said something sexist, racist to them at work? How can we lighten it up? The next question is, please comment on the movie Get Out and the use of humor to diffuse issues of cultural appropriation, political correctness, etc. And the third question in this row is, isn't Trump a snowflake and a jerk?
I like that. Yeah. Just like impact and intent, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So I would agree with that comment. In terms of injecting humor, I just bring it back to my introductory remarks. There are legitimate ways to be politically correct, and I think we all agree. I mean, there's a reason why, and please, Lord, this is a trigger warning. The reason why we don't say retard, or fag, or pussy. I mean, there are reasons why we don't have those words because they just makes you almost want to like cringe. Or deaf versus hearing impaired. There are reasons why we resort to language that doesn't further stigmatize certain groups, and I think that's all for the good. But to sort of lighten the load a little bit, I would encourage you to listen to George Carlin, the late great George Carlin, as he says, it can go off the rails a little bit, like rape victim, unwilling sperm recipient. It's it kind of it's on the edge there, but that's one way to lighten it. And I mean, Trump, yes, Trump, jerk and snowflake at the same time. It's simultaneous. It's uncanny.
I think humor is one of the few places where we're still really speaking the truth. Actually, humorous comedians, I think they're bold and they're willing to go out there and potentially offend people, and it makes them really unpopular sometimes. But a lot of times, if you look at it, and they're smart and they're aware and they're thoughtful about things, you see that the absurdity of what they're talking about is really pretty genius. I've thought sport and music and humor are 3 areas that actually provide a medium for us to have fruitful conversations at times that we can't have elsewhere, just because it's so raw, right? All 3 of those things. And so I see great opportunities, I think, in all 3 of those areas to advance the conversation. I wish there'd be more areas, but.
I wasn't going to say anything, but keep this short. I kind of reject the idea that most people, because I don't think that everyone needs to educate everybody, like especially if you're a minority in the community, either racial, gender, or sexual orientation. It's not your job to educate that person. It's nice, but it's not your job. And you can use whatever means are effective to you. If that's humor, that's great, but some people might not be okay with making a joke out of a person being raped. I think that's quite all right. So I'll just kind of leave that there.
Just one thing. To respectfully disagree with my co-panelist, I would say it is incumbent upon us. I mean, because we do want to make the world a better place, and I think it's easy. I mean, you're not obligated, obviously, to go into a conversation and say, well, I must nag this person to death. But I think if you want to bring about mutual understanding, if we want to create a world in which we are trying to spread equality and we want to fight for anti-racist activism, I think the idea of trying to bring allies into our cause means that we have to be patient enough to teach people. Obviously, it depends on the time of day. If we're feeling engaged or not, or who knows, maybe we're in a bad mood, fine. But I think overall it is incumbent upon us because we are the ones who want to be a force of good.
Yeah. Well, I think on that point, if you want to teach people, and if you believe it to be your responsibility, fine, then you do have to do that. But I don't necessarily think that the problem of racism is the problem of black and brown people. It is not your problem. Just as I don't think that misogyny or sexism is the problem of women. It impacts women, but it is a problem that men have. And just as I think that racism is not the problem of black people, it is the problem of white supremacy and whiteness at which engages black and brown folk in that capacity. So it is not, I respectfully disagree because I don't think it's your responsibility, because oftentimes when we're having conversations about, I need to teach you how to care for me, oftentimes I think that's the work. But yo, like, so much of my time and effort has been spent on surviving in a place where I have been recognized as little to nothing. So you now want me to ask and carve out time, personal space in my life that I've been afforded to the benefit of me, myself, and my family, to now use that to teach you. Oftentimes, I don't think that we should, so if it's a thing about energy, and I think it often is a thing about energy when you're talking to people of color, who oftentimes spend their energy surviving much differently than we do, right? And I think that it's very luxurious of us to have bright, brilliant conversations about love and privilege and oppression. Yo, I know a mom right now who got 4 kids and 6 jobs and still can hardly pay her rent. She ain't interested in teaching you what white privilege is. And she also, and I don't blame her, I'm not interested in her doing that either. Honey, I need you to live to feed your kids. And that's the responsibility I want them to spend most of their energy in. If they got extra, be creative.
So, it's my responsibility to call quit to this wonderful conversation. I want to thank Brandon, Malou, and Ty. Thank you all.
I want to get a copy of your first page.